December 1945. World War II is over. Japan has surrendered. But deep in the jungles of the Philippines, one soldier refuses to believe it. For 29 years, he hides in the forest. He conducts guerrilla attacks. He survives on stolen rice and jungle water. His name was Hiroo Onoda, and he thought the war was still going. Hiroo Onoda was not an ordinary infantry soldier thrown into battle without preparation. He was trained as an intelligence officer in the Imperial Japanese Army, taught not just how to fight, but how to think differently from conventional troops. At the Nakano Military School in Tokyo, he learned guerrilla warfare, sabotage, intelligence gathering, and psychological resilience. He was trained to operate behind enemy lines, to survive without support, and most importantly, to continue fighting even when cut off from command. His role was not to charge into open battle, but to disappear, observe, disrupt, and endure. By late 1944, the war was turning against Japan. American forces were advancing across the Pacific, island by island. Onoda, then 22 years old, was sent to Lubang Island in the Philippines in December of that year. The island was strategically important because of its airstrip and location along supply routes. His mission was clear: destroy the airfield, disrupt enemy operations, and conduct guerrilla warfare once American forces landed. He was expected to operate independently if necessary. Before departing, his commanding officer gave him an order that would define the next 30 decades of his life. Under no circumstances was he to surrender. He was not to take his own life. No matter what happened, no matter how long it took, he was to continue the mission. The war might last years, the officer said, but they would return for him. Those words were not symbolic encouragement. Onoda took them literally. As an intelligence officer trained to resist enemy deception, he absorbed the command as absolute truth. The idea of surrender was not simply dishonorable to him, it was forbidden. When American forces landed on Lubang in early 1945, Japanese defenses collapsed quickly. Many soldiers were killed or captured. But Onoda disappeared into the dense jungle with a small group of fellow holdouts. While the world moved toward the end of World War II, he began the long isolation that would define his life, convinced that his duty had only just begun. In August 1945, everything changed for the world. After the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the Soviet Union's declaration of war, Japan announced its surrender. Emperor Hirohito's voice was broadcast over the radio, informing the nation that the war had ended. Across Asia and the Pacific, Japanese troops were ordered to lay down their arms. For millions, it was the end of years of devastation. But deep in the jungles of Lubang Island, Hiroo Onoda did not experience that moment as liberation. Instead, he experienced confusion. Soon after Japan's surrender, leaflets began falling from the sky over Lubang. They announced that the war was over and instructed remaining Japanese soldiers to surrender peacefully. The messages explained that Japan had accepted defeat and that continuing to fight was unnecessary. For many isolated units across the Pacific, these leaflets were the first sign that the war had ended. Onoda examined them carefully. He did not accept them. As an intelligence officer, he had been trained specifically to expect enemy deception. Psychological warfare was not new to him. He believed the Americans would try to trick Japanese soldiers into surrendering by spreading false information. The idea that Japan could have surrendered felt impossible to him. It did not fit the mindset he had been raised with, nor the orders he had been given. His mission was to resist, to survive, and to wait for further command from his superior officer. No leaflet could override that. Later, radios were brought to the island by locals, and news broadcasts could sometimes be heard faintly through the jungle. The broadcasts repeated that Japan had surrendered. They mentioned reconstruction, occupation, and the end of the empire's military campaigns. To Onoda, these broadcasts only deepened his suspicion. He interpreted them as elaborate enemy propaganda designed to break his will. Over time, even letters and photographs from family members were dropped from aircraft, urging the remaining soldiers to return home. They included personal details that seemed authentic. Yet Onoda believed that such materials could be fabricated. He convinced himself that the Americans had gone to great lengths to imitate reality. Accepting the surrender would mean betraying his final orders, and so he chose disbelief. While cities were rebuilding and former soldiers were returning home to families who thought they were dead, Onoda tightened his grip on his rifle and moved deeper into the jungle. To him, the war had not ended, it had simply become quieter. After 1945, the jungle became their entire world. Hiroo Onoda and 3 other Japanese soldiers retreated into the dense forests of Lubang Island, determined to continue their mission. They built hidden shelters from bamboo and leaves, moving frequently to avoid detection. They survived on bananas, coconuts, wild roots, and stolen rice from local farms. When they needed protein, they hunted cows in the fields at night, cooking the meat secretly over small, smokeless fires. They lived like shadows. During the day, they observed from concealment. At night, they moved quietly across the island. They carried their rifles constantly, cleaned them carefully, and rationed ammunition as if reinforcements might arrive at any moment. Every distant sound in the jungle could have been an enemy patrol. Every villager might have been an informant. Years passed, but their mindset never shifted. They believed they were conducting a long-term guerrilla operation behind enemy lines. The small group slowly began to shrink. In 1949, one of the soldiers, Yuichi Akatsu, grew tired of the endless hiding. He slipped away from the group and eventually surrendered to Philippine authorities. When news reached Onoda that Akatsu was alive and had returned to Japan, he did not see it as proof that the war was over. Instead, he interpreted it as evidence that Akatsu had been captured and forced to speak under enemy control. In 1954, another member of the group, Corporal Shoichi Shimada, was killed during a shootout with local police while they were burning harvested rice. The confrontation reinforced Onoda's belief that real combat was still ongoing. If the war had truly ended, why were they still exchanging gunfire? For nearly 2 more decades, Onoda and the last remaining companion, Kinshichi Kozuka, continued their isolated campaign. They sabotaged crops they believed were supplying enemy forces and occasionally clashed with local authorities. Over time, their uniforms disintegrated into rags, patched repeatedly with jungle fabric. Their boots rotted away, yet their rifles still functioned. In 1972, Kozuka was shot and killed during another confrontation while attempting to destroy rice stocks. After 27 years in hiding, Onoda was suddenly alone. Most men would have surrendered then. Alone, aging, cut off from the world, he could have stepped out of the jungle at any time. But isolation had hardened his resolve rather than weakened it. He maintained his routines, cleaned his weapon, and continued to believe that Japan would eventually return for him. The mission had not been canceled. No superior officer had come to relieve him of duty. Years turned into decades. The jungle that had once felt like a battlefield became his permanent home. The outside world advanced into the modern age, television, space travel, global politics shifting, but Onoda remained locked in 1945, a soldier still waiting for orders that would not come. By the early 1970s, Hiroo Onoda had become something of a legend in Japan. Rumors persisted that he was still alive somewhere in the Philippines, still hiding, still fighting a war that had ended nearly 3 decades earlier. Search parties had tried to find him, letters had been left in the jumble, loudspeakers had called his name. Nothing worked. Then, in 1974, a young Japanese traveler named Norio Suzuki set out on a personal adventure. He told friends he wanted to find 3 things: Lieutenant Onoda, a panda, and the abominable snowman, in that order. Unlike official search teams, Suzuki traveled lightly and alone. He believed that if Onoda was still alive, he would respond better to a fellow Japanese civilian than to military or government representatives. After days of walking through the jungle of Lubang Island, Suzuki encountered a thin, weathered man in a faded, self-repaired uniform, rifle still in hand. It was Onoda. Remarkably, the two spoke calmly. Suzuki explained that Japan had changed, that the war had ended in 1945, that families had mourned him for years. Onoda listened carefully. He did not react with anger or disbelief toward Suzuki personally, but he remained firm. He told Suzuki he would not surrender unless his former commanding officer came in person and formally relieved him of duty. His orders in 1944 had been clear. He was to continue fighting and never surrender unless instructed otherwise by a superior. Leaflets were not enough. Radio broadcasts were not enough. Civilians were not enough. Only a direct command from the officer who had sent him to Lubang could end his mission. What happened next seemed almost unbelievable. The Japanese government located Onoda's former commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, who was now working in a bookstore. They flew him to the Philippines. In March 1974, nearly 29 years after the end of World War II, Taniguchi stood in the jungle, facing the soldier he had once commanded. He read the official orders. The war was over. The Imperial Japanese Army had ceased operations. Onoda was relieved of all military duties. Only then did something shift. Dressed in his worn uniform, carrying the same rifle he had maintained for decades, Onoda stepped forward and surrendered. His weapon was still functional. He had hundreds of rounds of ammunition. He had survived storms, illness, isolation, and the passage of nearly 30 years without abandoning his post. When he finally laid down his rifle, it was not in defeat, but in obedience. The war that had ended in 1945 finally ended for one man in 1974. Hiroo Onoda walked out of the jungle into a world that had moved on without him, a world of televisions, skyscrapers, and a Japan he no longer recognized. His story is not just about loyalty or duty, but about belief, isolation, and the power of a single order that shaped an entire lifetime. If you want more untold stories from World War II, told through the eyes of those who lived them, subscribe to WW2 Diaries, because history isn't just dates and battles, it's the people who never stopped living it.